You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, Katherine Carter. She not only has one of the most knowledgeable, fun, and funny history accounts on X, she's also the curator and historian at Chartwell. Now, Churchill files will know what that is, and that is Sir Winston's country home. Katherine is on today to discuss her book, which is, it's so well organized and it's so well written. And at the end of the book, she almost made this history nerd tear up because she has a timeline, which all books should have. Katherine Carter, author of Churchill's Citadel, Chartwell, and The Gatherings Before the Storm. Thank you for appearing on the podcast.
My pleasure. It's lovely to join you this evening, Robert.
I'm sitting here very worried that my cat is going to make a bunch of noise and interfere, and I'm laughing because I see your cat desperately needing attention.
Do you know, and it's funny, he sensed as soon as we started recording as well. Like, he wasn't here until that moment, and then it's my turn.
Let me give you a couple for the listeners. Reviews. Quote, "No one could be better qualified than Katherine Carter to write this fascinating account of the way that Winston Churchill used Chartwell Manor as the indispensable center of his political, social, literary, familiar, and also espionage operations during his wilderness years." That's from Andrew Roberts. "A brilliant idea, brilliantly done. Not just the most original account of the build-up to the Second World War you will read, but immensely entertaining as well." That's Tom Holland. "I can only imagine how much work goes into a book like this, and you are sitting there in the spaces where Winston Churchill wrote some of his most famous books." Before we get into the meat of it, I wanted to acknowledge these wonderful reviews and just ask you quickly, how hard did you work? And was it a labor of love to write this book?
It was definitely a labor of love, without question. I am so delighted to have been able to write this book. If anything, I'm astonished that it hadn't been written sooner by someone else. And so I'm delighted that there was a gap left in the historiography for a focus on the significance of Winston Churchill's country home, because I think it really is, and I argue with this throughout the book, because he had Chartwell, that he was able to have these meetings that then equipped him with the knowledge to be in the position of authority on Nazi Germany, to be appointed prime minister. So I do argue that Chartwell changed the course of history. In terms of the writing of it itself, it was 4 years in total from the moment I first began conversations with my publisher to it being released. But truth be told, I started at Chartwell in 2013. And I think there'd been in the back of my mind the idea of a book even from as long ago as that. I am so excited that it is now come to fruition.
Those of us who are lucky enough to have visited Chartwell, it is everything you describe in your book and more, because you actually get to walk around and I may have touched things that I shouldn't have, Ms. Carter. So forgive me. I'll send you a donation to make up for my American snobbery, as I was like, wonder what this is. And I touched little things and tried to move so I could see the back of stuff. It's phenomenally done. Let's talk about Chartwell so we can get a sense of its setting, how it came into the Churchill family, how old it is. And the word would be bucolic, but there's other words to use about why this was perfectly situated for Mr. Churchill to begin his political comeback. Not only that, but to start to build, at least in Great Britain, the alliance of leaders who would defeat Nazi Germany.
So to go to the house's origins, we're going back hundreds of years, but I won't do all of that in depth because otherwise we'd be here for hours. But there's been a house on the site of Chartwell since the 1300s, believe it or not. Now, none of that ancient building survives, but there is a part of the building at its very core that you would have, when you visited Chartwell, that you would have been through, that is Tudor. So the absolute sort of heart of the house is Tudor, around the reign of Henry VIII. And over subsequent centuries, it got added on and extended, of course, naturally, as people do with homes over hundreds of years. And Winston Churchill first saw it in 1921. And he fell in love with it at first sight. Although I should say he fell in love with the view far more so than the house itself. So Chartwell sits at the top of a valley. And if you are stood on the side of the house and looking out across the landscape, you have beautiful formal gardens in the foreground, and then you've got lakes and woodland beyond that are all part of the estate. And then beyond that, the landscape just falls away into fields and woodland for about 40 miles on a clear day, you can see from Chartwell itself. So it's a spectacular setting, and one that would have certainly appealed to Winston Churchill's artist's eye, as was developing by that point in 1921. Countless sources of inspiration across those beautiful views. And he bought the house for £5,000, although it needed a huge amount of work doing. So it was 2 years and another 20,000 on the remodelling and 10,000 on furnishing and decorating. So a house bought for 5,000 cost £35,000. So imagine spending 7 times more than just the purchase price of a house on making it inhabitable. It was a place that clearly Winston Churchill loved in order to pour all that time and effort and money into it. And by the time they moved in, it was just the place he wanted to be more than anywhere else in the world. I've heard one historian say it was the second love of his life after Clementine, and I think that's a really good way of putting it.
Now, Churchill famously was born, I say to the manor born, but was born at Blenheim Palace. And he, in 1880?
1874.
And he dies in 1965.
Correct, yes.
He's born to wealth. He's born to privilege. But wealth and privilege didn't necessarily afford him this home. How did he come up with the means to buy and also renovate such a beautiful place?
In terms of Winston Churchill's money, he's, believe it or not, actually largely a self-made man. It's actually his pen that is always his main source of income, because his ancestors are the Dukes of Marlborough, and his grandfather is a Duke of Marlborough. But his father is one of the younger sons, and the dukedom doesn't go down his line. So actually, he has to make his own way. And it is because of writing throughout his life, even when he's in politics, writing continues as a career in parallel. But the particular moment he bought Chartwell, there was a boost to his finances thanks to the death of a distant relative, which left a rather sizable inheritance in Winston Churchill's direction. So it was that boost which pushed them over the line of making Chartwell affordable. But even then, like I said, it really was a money pit of a house. And I realised I didn't say earlier why. The building was really flawed, in part because of this beautiful location with the landscape that falls away. But the downside of that means it's completely unsheltered from the elements. So when you have the full force of British storms, and they can be strong and they can be wet, it's hitting that building without anything protecting it. And so there were stories, for example, about the family who lived there before the Churchills, that the matriarch would have to read her newspapers in bed with her umbrella up. such was the amount of water just coming in the building. So that's what Winston Churchill bought, this really flawed, leaky house with rot, with mould. So that's why it needed so much money spending on it. And that's why it was all the sweeter when he finally got through its doors.
Winston Churchill at this time, we're basically focusing on the 1930s, it's fair to say. He had already led 2 or 3 lifetimes by then. So what was Winston Churchill's political condition status at this time when he buys Chartwell, when he's plotting his, I'm going to say plotting his comeback, but I can't think of another way to put it.
So Winston Churchill's career by this point has been an absolute roller coaster. He has, even just in terms of which party he is representing, he starts out with the Conservatives in 1900, moves to the Liberals in 1904, and then he moves back to the Conservatives in 1924. So when he buys Chartwell, he's still a Liberal MP, and by the time he moves in, he's moved back to Conservatives. So it's a really shifting sands time in terms of politically. Even though he's changed parties in the years leading up to the acquisition of Chartwell, he has held very high offices in British politics, including Home Secretary, which is one of the great offices of state, so one of the most senior offices in British politics. He's also been First Lord of the Admiralty at the outset of the First World War. Unfortunately, it was while he was holding that office that a military campaign known as Gallipoli took place, with which he was primarily associated. It resulted in a significant number of casualties. And so he ended up being blamed by a lot of people at the time and fell on his sword, resigned from government and went to fight on the Western Front because he had been, earlier in his career, a soldier for the British Army. So he felt that he should go to the Western Front.
Prisoner of war. He had been a prisoner of war. I mean,
he had been a prisoner of war. He had been at the last cavalry charge in British military history. So some really iconic moments in terms of late 19th century military history he was literally there at. But now we're talking 1920s. So he's back to the Conservatives. And fortunately, he is quickly invited to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. So that's the role that's generally seen as second highest in British politics, and it is running the country's economy. So actually, when he's finally in the door at Chartwell, he's back with the Conservatives. He's got this really senior political office. So actually, at that point, things are looking good. But unfortunately, as is often the case with Winston Churchill, things rarely stay stable in terms of his career. And an election in 1929 sees his party voted out of office. And so he is then in opposition.
World War I, the Great War. I just finished which I haven't posted yet, and I can't remember. I'm not sure I want to make a temporal reference because I'm not sure when it's going to get posted, but I just finished doing a 2-part interview with Nick Lloyd. He wrote a book.
Wonderful. Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm familiar with his work, yes.
Yeah, one on the Western Front, his book on the Western Front, one on his book on the Eastern Front. They're fabulous, fabulous. World War I, here in the States, obviously, it's completely different than it is in European memory and British memory. I've been to England, I think 8 times, and I come across something new about the Great War every time I'm there. How did the Great War focus Churchill's mind on the need to confront Hitler, control Germany, and how did his experiences and Britain's experiences in the Great War prove to be the foundation for everything that Churchill tried to accomplish through Chartwell?
The First World War, of course, for Britain was an absolutely devastating conflict. And in the interwar years, it became known as the war to end all wars, because such was the belief that surely no war could happen again, that the horrors of the First World War were so fresh in people's minds and the devastation had been so universal. There was barely a village in England that hadn't lost a number of young men on the fields of the sort of Franco-Belgian border and other theatres, of course, in the First World War. So the tricky thing about the First World War is actually, in a way, it hampers Churchill's progress in some ways in the 1930s because so many people can't stomach the thought of another war. And actually that leads them to be quite sort of head in the sand about the Nazis and their what we can now see as pretty blatant ambitions towards territorial expansion. You only need to read Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf to see that he has laid out very early on what he plans to do upon ascending to power. But the First World War, it's so close in the rearview mirror that people just are determined to to not think about it. And I think that's where Winston Churchill really stands out, because he is able to use, yes, his experience as a soldier, yes, his experience of having led Britain's navy at the outset of war, but also his experience as a historian. So he has spent much of his life analysing tyrants of the past. Things like looking at the battles which his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, was embroiled in. And he could see the sort of playbook of tyrants and see these echoes of what Adolf Hitler was doing compared to what had gone in the past. And so he was incredibly brave in saying, actually, what he wanted to do was to prevent war. A lot of his efforts were hoped to be a deterrent. So his efforts to ensure that Britain was rearmed was in the hope that it would deter Adolf Hitler. His hope that through collective security and the cultivation of alliances, this would deter Adolf Hitler. But ultimately, the British government, in terms of the action it took, and Winston Churchill, it should be said, wasn't in government throughout the 1930s. He was this lone voice speaking out against the government's policies. And the government for too long just put their head in the sands. And unfortunately, I think the First World War was part of the reason that people couldn't confront the fact that war was looming.
Because not only had people in government, and you detail this, served in the front lines or served in the Great War somehow, uh, or they had sons who served and died in the Great War. But if you go to, and this is one of my favorite things about visiting Britain, is you go to little towns, you go to small churches, and there's the plaque. And it's the plaque that lists everyone in the parish or the town who died in World War One. It's so, the commemoration of it. The only thing the we have over here that would rival it would be the American Civil War. That's in my view, because it all happened here.
Mm-hmm.
But your choice of the, and you use it in the book, and I was dead on the money, is a head in the sand. They just couldn't, in all of my reading on it, couldn't believe that another war could happen. Like, it can't happen again. It can't. And Churchill is saying, not only can it, but this fella Hitler is the guy who's going to make it happen. So focusing a lot on the Air Force in the preparation, was it something about Churchill and his sort of zigzag political history that made his contemporaries push back a little bit? In other words, it was Churchill, and they just didn't want to deal with him. And they didn't want to give him the credence that he was right.
Winston Churchill was always someone who followed his own political compass. And that, given how British politics works, can make you quite easy to alienate, because ultimately the political party you serve have a steer as to how you should vote. And so you're voting against your party if you vote differently to that steer. So he is doing that time and time again because he's following his own political compass. And I think it's a really good point that you've made, that actually the fact that he crosses the floor means he always has a political party, but actually his own sense of what he thinks is right is what he's going to follow. And it's interesting you say about the other individuals who had served in the First World War, who by this point had senior offices in British politics, because there's a quote around this time in the 1930s where Stanley Baldwin, who's a very senior political figure in the Conservative Party, makes the remark that the bomber always gets through. Because of the nature of technological development in the interwar years, particularly in terms of aviation, the fear is that if another war breaks out, it will just be complete destruction. And so that's why so many senior figures in British politics are willing to secure peace at all costs. That is why that is the only path that they consider, which is why they keep acquiescing to Adolf Hitler. Whereas Winston Churchill, and this is one of the chapters of my book where I talk about a visit by T.E. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia to many. And by this point in the 30s, he's serving with the Royal Air Force. The conversation that happens in that chapter on that visit is Winston Churchill asking Lawrence's opinion about how you would defend civilian populations in the event of aerial bombardment, in the event of war coming from the skies on civilians. And the fact that Winston Churchill is even starting to think in that way when other people around him are just going, no, it can't happen, because if war in the sky plays out, that's game over. But Churchill's going, actually, no, we need to think of solutions, because it's entirely possible that this will come to fruition. And from what he had seen in Germany in 1932, which is the introduction of my book, that's where he starts to see these tells among the people that he's seeing in Germany, among the sort of the young men who are marching up and down the streets, that actually there's a hunger for war, and that terrifies him from 1932 onwards. And that's why he can't let this mood music of peace at all costs overrule the need to prepare for war.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today, author, historian, Katherine Carter. We are discussing her marvelous book, Churchill's Citadel, Chartwell and the Gatherings Before the Storm. But you choose to start your book not at Chartwell, but in Munich. And one of the greatest near misses of all time. You detail the what if dinner meal that was being arranged that would have sat Winston Churchill with Adolf Hitler. Why did you choose to start with an event that didn't take place in southeastern England at Chartwell?
That's a really good question, because the premise of my book is meetings that happened at Chartwell. But I thought it was really interesting that it was an almost meeting that happened in Germany, which is what set him on that path. That it was because of his time in Germany that he came back to Britain and made his first speech warning of what he called a war mentality in Germany that he had seen while he had been over there. And it is for that reason, that very first speech he makes in November 1932, that because it is such a rare thing to be voicing concern about the Nazis at this point in time, he's not actually chancellor yet, I should say. Adolf Hitler isn't chancellor in 1932, but his party is the largest in the Reichstag. So Churchill is so prescient in making this warning in 32. And it's because of that, and because he's this lone voice, that he then has almost this gravitational pull for people who agree with him. And this very handily remote location in rural Kent that is Chartwell, where these people could go and have completely confidential conversations, knowing that it wasn't the case that they were having a chat in London and someone could overhear. This was so serious and needed to be kept absolute secret in a lot of these instances, that it was the events in Munich in 1932 which led to Churchill having this realization about the Nazis, and that led to Chartwell metamorphosing from this rural idyll to center stage for his campaign against the Nazis.
Is there anyone who, let's say, wasn't a member of the royal family or a prime minister who could have, who had the gravitas to say, yeah, I'll take a 2 or 3 hour car ride out to my place and talk? In other words, come see me, and have someone say, you know what, we got to go see Winston. Like, he had that much respect for his ability to assess the situation. And you said prescient. So is that something that makes Winston Churchill unique at this time? People are willing to make the drive, because we're not talking about 20 minutes on a train, to make the drive to hear what he has to say.
For me, in terms of Chartwell's location, it is remote in the sense that it's several miles from the nearest village or the nearest train station or that sort of thing. But it isn't an insurmountable journey. So if you were being driven from Westminster, for example, you could get to Chartwell in under an hour in the 1920s, maybe slightly longer by the 1930s, but not too much longer. So it isn't so much the distance that makes it remarkable. To me, it's more the case that Winston Churchill is a backbench member of parliament. He represents an individual constituency who have voted him to keep him as their member of parliament, but he's not in government.
Mm.
And yet he is commanding the likes of ambassadors, the former French prime minister, a former chancellor of Germany from the Weimar government before the Nazis. These extremely influential people who, because Winston Churchill is one of the very few people who are sounding the alarm about the Nazis, they go, he is the person I need to be in conversation with, because so many other people in British politics are deaf to concerns about the Nazis, or so it seems at that point in time.
So
So that
it's that was my point is, forgive me, it's him. They're willing to make the drive. They're willing to do whatever to talk to him to get his points of view. And Chartwell is not incidental. I just think it's interesting that, as you said, a guy whose politics has been somewhat malleable, who has infuriated almost everybody at some point. Gallipoli is laid at his feet. The failure of Gallipoli. He isn't in power by any, and that's another great theme of your book, that he isn't in power at all. So you could easily just say, I don't really care when he's a crank, let him write his books. I don't care what he says. But he's got the gravitas to pull people away from London or away from the continent of Europe to have these conversations. And to me, that's one of the most fascinating things about your book is that is clear. People feel the need. We're got to go to, and sometimes the meeting, the conversations he has, as you detail, are in London, Morpeth Mansions, I believe. But Churchill still has that pull. And that is a great theme of your book. People do come to see him. I want to ask about particular people. But before I do that, because I don't want to miss out on this opportunity, you do a terrific job of detailing the activity at Chartwell, in the house, on the manor. Clementine?
yes, Clementine, you're absolutely right. That's the pronunciation.
Clementine Churchill, his wife, is this sort of wonderfully warm, uh, benevolent figure trying to make the trains run all time and make sure that her husband has everything he needs. They have children, they have grandchildren. Tell the Leaders and Legends podcast audience a little bit about what it was like to be at Chartwell, in the house or on the grounds on any given day.
To be at Chartwell, if you got invited to Chartwell, you were a very lucky person because you were going to have a good time. I think it's safe to say there are wonderful accounts of people who joined the Churchills for dinner, and oh my gosh, to be a fly on the wall for some of those evenings. They sound absolutely brilliant. Churchill holding court, champagne flowing. If you were there for a longer stay, perhaps over for a weekend, you'd be invited to go swim with the family in their swimming pool. You'd go for lovely long walks around the gardens. Churchill would be demonstrating the brick walls he's been building. So it was a really fun, warm, happy place. Having said that, at the time that he needed to work, he needed to get into the zone. And that's where the study, the room on the top floor of the house, where he would work on his articles, speeches, books until 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning. That space needed to be held absolutely clear for focus and concentration. But then Chartwell generally, it was just a really wonderful place to be. And even actually the staff who worked at Chartwell, and I've been really delighted in this book to bring their voices to life and include their stories. They've got some really rich and wonderful memories of how extraordinary it was to be there at that time. From the secretaries who were working until just as late as Winston Churchill in that study to help him with his political and literary output, to the chauffeurs, the gardeners. So there's this entire community that orbits around Chartwell, as well as the family itself, and of course with Winston Churchill at the epicenter of proceedings.
Food, drink, smoke, swim, painting. Why did
Absolutely.
why did Winston Churchill take to painting? What did that do for him?
The way that I think of Churchill's painting is that it was like an antidote to the pressures and frustrations and strain of politics. And you could see that at moments of particularly acute frustration over his political career, he throws himself even more into painting. It's almost like he needs it. He needs that way of completely occupying his hands and his mind to escape from, like I said, the pressures and frustrations of what's going on. So he starts painting during the First World War, and it's a pastime that he continues right through until I think the very last one that's been attributed to him is 1960s. So it's half a century of his life is spent really loving what he called a joyride in a playbox. Joy in a paint box, sorry, I should say.
Hmm.
So he finds it this really fascinating thing to try and perfect how to depict what you are seeing before you on canvas. And it's one of the few elements of Winston Churchill where he's actually remarkably modest. Often shows people paintings but goes, oh, they're not very good. And people go, well, actually, they are pretty good, especially since this isn't even your main pursuit. You are someone who has held almost every major office of state, written tens of books, had 5 children. Painting is something you do in your spare time. And actually, there are a lot of his canvases that are really accomplished. And we've got the largest collection on public display in the world at Chartwell.
You mentioned his writing. The books that he wrote remain, I have them, remain actually one of my favorite books. I'm trying to think because I have another book by the same author right here. Give me just one second. It's by David Reynolds.
Mhm.
And it's the book that David Reynolds wrote about Churchill writing his books about the Second World War. I don't know if you've ever read it, but it gives you such great insight into him. I'm assuming there was probably no difference when he was writing his biography of his ancestor, John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, his book, The World Books on the World Crisis, his detailing of the World War One. He also was in the process of writing the monumental history of the English speaking peoples at the same time. So he's making real contributions to historiography, to history literature at this time. And yet, in the middle of all this, he finds time to make this inestimable contribution to confronting Hitler. The first person you detail who visits, and I was obviously the almost near miss with Hitler, was a wonderful way to whet the reader's appetite. Wow, this book's got some really, I hate to say juicy nuggets, but that's what we'd say here in the States. It's almost like the Mary Queen of Scots, Queen Elizabeth. What if they had ever met? How'd things be different? July 22nd, 1933. So I think by now Hitler's in power.
Correct, yes.
Albert Einstein. Why did Einstein go to Chartwell?
Do you know what? That question is part of the reason I wrote this book. Because it was one of those things that some people seem to be aware of that a visit had happened. And there's a photograph that survives. 2, in fact, actually, one of which I was able to uncover. But there's one relatively famous one if you're interested in Churchill circles. But no one ever seemed to outline why. What was the conversation? What was the context? What had brought Albert Einstein to Winston Churchill's country home? And the truth is that he was on the run at that point. Albert Einstein was a German Jewish scientist, and in being that was pretty much everything that Adolf Hitler hated. And of course, with Adolf Hitler having come to power in January 1933, he very quickly started enacting laws to make life very difficult for German Jewish citizens. And given that Einstein is, by this point, probably the most well-known scientist in the world, he is someone who is quickly held up as an enemy of the regime. So much so that there is an astonishing newspaper article I found in a Nazi propaganda newspaper where it was the case that a photograph of Albert Einstein was accompanied by the caption, "Not yet hanged." So Albert Einstein, he's on the run. He has renounced his German citizenship. But he doesn't want to leave his colleagues and those like him in the lurch in Germany. He knows he can get out and he can get another job somewhere else in the world pretty easily. He's a Nobel Prize winner by that point, for example.
Einstein, he knows that he can get a job, but he's worried about his friends, the other scientists who aren't as prominent, and he's looking for help. Is that a fair thing to say?
That's exactly it. He is looking for support from the political elite in Britain to help ensure safe passage of fellow German Jewish academics out of Germany. But as well as that, of course, he could be saying that to anyone. But the reason he singles Winston Churchill out is because Winston Churchill has already started making speeches warning against the Nazis, which is a very rare thing. So Einstein, yes, he comes to make this sort of plea for help for his colleagues, but also he comes to bring his own insights and observations and testimonial about the terror that is starting to be inflicted on German citizens. And so you have this remarkable situation where Albert Einstein comes to Winston Churchill's house to outline his experience. And this then helps feed into a very rich tapestry that Churchill rapidly creates of a combination of testimonials, eyewitness accounts, military intelligence, data, reports. He starts to gather all of these at Chartwell, but the Einstein one is really the starter for these really significant meetings.
If your anti-Semitism is so rampant, it's so vile that you're going to kick out your leading scientists as you propel your country into what clearly was going to be a technological war. If I was there, I'd be like, well, if he's going to get rid of Einstein, then who the hell is he going to keep? Einstein moves to the United States, famously signs the letter about nuclear power, atomic energy, atomic bombs. Is there a situation where Einstein could have stayed in Britain? Because in your book, a lot of the people you mentioned, both who visited Chartwell and who were ancillarily related or connected to people who visited Chartwell, were desperate to get to the United States. Why was England not far enough away from Hitler for a lot of these people?
I would think it's likely because with the First World War being such a recent memory, you don't have to think back. It's closer time-wise than the millennium is to us that Britain and Germany were at war. So if you are of the belief that Germany is starting to maneuver in the direction of territorial expansion, you're going to be much more comfortable with an ocean between you and that conflict.
And not, as the French say, la Manche.
Not quite.
The second person I wanted to discuss is someone who's known pretty well in American history, not as well as his sons, and that is a fabulously, ridiculously wealthy man named Joseph Kennedy, Joseph P. Kennedy, who eventually becomes the American ambassador to Great Britain, which is a position that basically requires great wealth because of all the things that are expected of you when you're there entertaining and such. His reputation here in America takes considerable hits for several reasons. But in your book, I hate to say that he comes off as a villain, and that may not be your intent, and maybe that's just my prejudice, but he is so damn wrong on everything. He is known as an appeaser. You mentioned that earlier. How did Churchill and Kennedy get along? And what did Churchill think of Kennedy's views on Europe, on Hitler?
The meeting where Joseph P. Kennedy and his wife Rose came to Chartwell is one of the earlier chapters in my book. So this is October 1935. And it comes about because Kennedy and Churchill's mutual friend, Bernard Baruch, knows that Kennedy is making his way across the Atlantic towards England. And he sends Churchill a message saying, this man who has the ear of the president is on his way to London, and I strongly suggest, reach out to him and invite him to your home. So that's the way it comes about. They hadn't actually met previously. It was entirely as a result of this third party that it comes about. And Generally, where Joe Kennedy goes during his time in London, he's greeted very effusively and people are hanging on his every word, doing that thing where you're just captivated and you're letting them talk. But the other side of the coin is when they come to Chartwell, because Winston Churchill has essentially a pitch to make that he wants to, in due course, get to the president. And he thinks, I've got a couple of hours with this guy. I haven't really got time for sort of niceties and chit chat. I'm going to make my pitch because it's too important not to. And it's a rather remarkable pitch, in fact, because what Churchill is proposing is some sort of Anglo American shared naval police force to ensure the security of the seas. And you might be thinking, why in 1935 would Winston Churchill be thinking about something like that? The reason being that just a few months earlier, the British government have signed something called the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which is an astonishing document because it was intended to allow Germany to rebuild its navy to a third of the size of the British fleet, which would be giving the green light to naval expansion. But actually, it was such a convoluted agreement that what was actually agreed to was a third of the size of British and Commonwealth fleets combined. So you're looking at the green light for massive naval expansion by a country that Churchill is already, by this point, pretty sure is preparing for war. And he has been First Lord of the Admiralty early in his career, so he can see instantly the sea is a real risk. And that's what he is hoping that he can persuade Kennedy is the case and lead to, hopefully, a beautiful friendship. But unfortunately, it doesn't go quite as Winston Churchill hoped.
And it's important to say that the expansion of the German Navy is a significant contributing factor to the outbreak of the Great War in August of 1914. Kennedy is also Irish, and the Irish and the English, or the Brits, however you want to say it, don't exactly. This isn't a honeymoon period between the two. I think Ireland's independence, Irish Free State, is that 1922?
21.
Is it 21?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that going on. Roosevelt and Kennedy eventually have a falling out,
Mm-hmm.
as you mentioned. The appeasers in Britain. Why was it so easy for Kennedy to take that view? It's not like World War II in the sense that he loses a son. I think he has a daughter who's in a plane crash during World War II and dies. Obviously, John F. Kennedy suffered significant injuries in the Pacific. But the Kennedy family, as far as I recall, it's not like they suffered significant family losses in World War One. What do you think is really the genesis of the foundation of Kennedy's uh, appeasement stance or accommodation stance? To me, it seems to be that England's just weak and there's no way they can stand up to Germany. They're fighting for the quote, it's at the end of your book, and I can't remember. They're just, what do they hope to accomplish by this fighting? They're going to lose anyway. Is that fair?
It's in terms of why Kennedy has the beliefs he has, there are, unfortunately, to be an appeaser at that point in time is not a rare thing. And it's worth remembering that. Churchill is the one who has the rare position at this point in time in terms of openly opposing the Nazis. And I think there's two very telling moments that come to fruition later in the book. And I should say as well that for each of the protagonists, I do bring their narratives back in even beyond the chapter itself. For example, there's a dinner once where Churchill is told that Kennedy has been reflecting on the likelihood of war, remarks that Britain would get licked, and apparently utters this with delight. Which you can imagine Winston Churchill's reaction, having been making the campaign he's been making for the best part of a decade, to hearing that being uttered by his former house guest. But then there's also a moment after the outbreak of war where Kennedy publicly exclaims, "I hate every Englishman from Churchill down." So I think there is definitely a case of sort of national identity playing into his beliefs as well. But as we all know from how history turned out, Churchill was the one who was right on that score.
I can't think of very many people who have been more wrong about more things than Joseph Kennedy, but that's a whole nother podcast, perhaps. People came to Winston Churchill, invited people to Chart for various reasons. You mentioned some of them. He had a terrific network of spies and informants and educated people, scholars who helped fuel the discussion. Were there people he brought down or invited solely to convince them to change their minds? If so, how successful was he in doing that?
His efforts to change hearts and minds on the subject of Nazi Germany, they were probably conversations that were happening in London because they didn't need the level of confidentiality or even secrecy. That's why Chartwell, by and large, tends to be the place where he's bringing people who are the ones providing him with intelligence or testimonials or eyewitness accounts. It's those people who, in some instances, are fearing for their own lives if people know that they're having conversations with Winston Churchill. There's one gentleman, for example, who is coming on behalf of a group of German generals who want to overthrow Hitler. That's not a conversation that you want to be having representing these dissident generals at the Savoy, which is where Churchill often had some of the more light-hearted meetings. So it was a different flavour of visitor. Rather than those he was trying to convert, it tended to be those who were supporting his campaign.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is Katherine Carter, historian and author. We are discussing her book, Churchill's Citadel, Chartwell and the Gatherings Before the Storm. Do you have a favorite Churchill biographer or Churchill book?
Oh, that's a really good question. If you're talking about a sort of cradle to grave biography, I think Andrew Roberts is hard to beat as a single volume, but I also think the William Manchester series is a brilliant set as well. But what I love about Churchill as a subject is there's so many different angles that people can take. There's a brilliant book about Churchill's finances, which seems like a really niche area by an author called David Locke, but that is such a brilliant read. There's even ones about Churchill's interest in equestrianism that is fascinating, if that's the angle that you're interested in. The great thing about Churchill is there's something for everyone.
The first book I read on Churchill was The Churchill Factor.
Oh, yes, Boris Johnson's book.
Boris Johnson. Do you have high opinion of that?
Actually, he came to Chartwell to research for that book. So I was at Chartwell when he made a couple of visits out as part of his research. And it's often one that I recommend to people who aren't already Churchill aficionados. If you're dipping your toe in the water, it's quite a fun read and very engagingly written.
I've recommended it to several friends of mine over here in the States. If you want to read a book about Churchill that'll get you started, that's the one in my view to read. What is your opinion of the movie?
Darkest Hour. Again, there were some parts of that filmed at Chartwell as well. So a lot of these things that have happened since 2013, I'm delighted to say I've been sort of on the fringes of in one way or another. I thought Gary Oldman did a brilliant job. He came to research at Chartwell as well, actually, and I remember him asking me who my favourite actor was who played Churchill to date. And I said to him that at that point, Albert Finney was my favourite, who starred in The Gathering Storm. I think phenomenal. And so Mr. Oldman said to me, do you know what? I'm going to try and beat him. I'm going to try and take over him. And you know, I want to come back here and for you to say I'm the favourite. And he did. Gary Oldman came back after he'd won the Oscar. And we had that conversation. And truth be told, I'd put them as pretty level pegging. I think Finney is very hard to beat, but I think Gary Oldman did an absolutely outstanding job.
In your book, when you discuss, or you allude more than you discuss, to Churchill's finances and financial problems, I'm taken back to the scene in the movie where she screams, "I dare!" Where the actress Kristen, I forget her name, Kristen Scott Thomas exclaims, "We're broke. We can't spend another penny." And talk, please, a little bit about, because you wouldn't think that someone who had all these sorts of things pushing him forward would have financial difficulties, but he not only did he have them in the time period of your book, he had them after the war. After the Second World War, forgive me.
Winston Churchill's finances could oscillate extraordinarily between being very up and very down. The purchase of Chartwell immediately put them at a huge financial disadvantage because the costs spiraled so far beyond what they'd budgeted and they borrowed a lot. And then on top of that, just the day-to-day running costs of a house like Chartwell. You need to have a huge staff for an estate of that kind. And also there were continuing problems with the building even after they'd moved in, resulting in yet more costs. So much so that there is a brilliant memorandum that Churchill writes for Clementine in 1926, where he lists 14 ways in which they urgently need to save money. And given that Clementine had been against buying Chartwell, I'd love to have seen her reaction to being presented with that list of things we need to spend less money on. But what makes things even worse, so they're pretty straightened in the mid 1920s. Then Churchill goes on a lecture tour of the US in the autumn of 1929, starts dabbling on the stock market. And of course, that's probably the worst time in history to just start speculating in stocks. And courtesy of the Wall Street crash, loses about £1 million instantly as a result of that. So they're already on a knife edge financially. Then the Wall Street crash happens. And it's for that reason that he really retreats into Chartwell in the 30s, because writing is his way of recouping that. And he does get a sizable advance for the biography of Marlborough, which helps keep them afloat. But then again, now he's got to write the thing, which is part of the reason that he is working on that in parallel with his political campaigns across that decade. Then, after the Second World War, of course, he's not been writing all that time. And they had nearly sold Chartwell before the war broke out because they couldn't afford it. At which point, a group of admirers clubbed together, bought Chartwell for its market value at that point, gave it to the National Trust, who run it to this day and who are my employer as its curator. But the arrangement was that the Churchills could live there for the rest of their lives. So that really was the moment they could draw breath financially, because suddenly this money pit of a house they could live in, and things like any work to the outer envelope of the building was covered by the National Trust, even in the 20 years there after this transaction had happened. And also, soon after that, his 6-volume history of the Second World War is published. It's an international bestseller. So from that point, things are looking a lot healthier financially, but they've really gone through the ringer in terms of their finances leading up to that point.
Most of the people who you detail as visitors to Chartwell are related to the gathering storm, no pun intended, for that's coming in the late 30s and 40s. It's a bit of a, and forgive me, you correct me if I characterize this incorrectly, a bit of a detour, and that's chapter 5 in The Visitor is Archibald Sinclair,
Mm-hmm.
and it's December of 36. The On the Leaders and Legends podcast, we were lucky enough to have had Alexander Larman as a guest. His incredible book, I think it's called The Crown in Crisis, about the abdication of King Edward VIII. Churchill, once again, for whatever reason, loyalty, and among others, perhaps, he's Churchill on this, and he backs Edward VIII until he can't back him anymore. What were the discussions at Chartwell about the abdication crisis after the death of George V, the uncrowned kingship of Edward VIII? He abdicates in December, I think, of 36 so that he can marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson, which then brings us King George VI and literally to Charles III at the moment. What happened at Chartwell? Why was Churchill seen as someone who needed to be involved in this tremendous constitutional crisis?
It's interesting that you pointed out that one does feel like it's not following on quite the same path as the rest of the chapters, but I thought it was important to include because actually it takes the wind out of the sails of Churchill's campaign, because he calls it so badly that actually there are a lot of people who then question Winston Churchill's political judgment, which then affects how seriously they take his campaign against the Nazis. So it really is, it derails, essentially, his campaign. So that's why I wanted to include it. In terms of the conversation that happens at Chartwell, essentially, Winston Churchill wants to buy time for Edward VIII because Edward VIII is saying he wants to marry Wallis Simpson. The government is threatening to resign if this happens. Like you said, a constitutional crisis is very possible at this point. And I think it's easy to forget how, if you're Winston Churchill in the 1930s and you're someone who has always got the bigger picture in mind, there are a number of royal households that have fallen across Europe in various countries. And those countries often then fall into unrest, civil war, and actually monarchy can serve as a stabilizing influence. So what would the risk be if we lost that, if it was destabilized in the form of this constitutional crisis? So Winston Churchill wants to buy time for a number of reasons. Firstly, he wants to see if there is constitutional precedent that would support Edward VIII not having to abdicate, potentially. He also thinks it's entirely possible that Edward VIII might lose interest in Wallis Simpson, in which
Mm.
case all of this has been for nothing. She's not the first love of his life. He's had long-term mistresses in the past with whom he has been deeply in love. But then ultimately he's lost interest. So why put the crown through all this? Why don't we just put the brakes on and see? But there's also the fact that there's a lot of people who are pro Edward VIII marrying Wallis Simpson. And actually, is there something where Churchill can use this to his advantage? Because he's in opposition against the government on the subject of Germany and a number of other issues. Maybe if there's real public support for this and he can be the figurehead, he can use this to his advantage. Churchill's a political player down to his bones, so there will have been thought about how he could benefit from it as well. What Churchill doesn't realise is he's making all these plans when Edward VIII is pretty much already set on abdicating. And there's various things that happen around that time, I won't give too much away, where it just becomes very obvious very quickly that Churchill's backed the wrong horse, essentially.
The Crown in Crisis and the follow-up. The Windsors at War, I think, is the follow-up book that Mr. Larman wrote. Wonderful. So much here in the United States, so much of our view of this time period is popular, is history, it's theater, it's plays, whatever. And the King's Speech, this is dealt with, even though it's very interesting that Churchill doesn't seem to be pro Edward VIII in the movie, for what it's worth. Did he ever look back and lament that he seemed to be pro Edward VIII and let's figure out a way for him to keep the throne no matter what else happens?
Do you mean, did he look back and question whether he'd made the right call at the time? Do you mean that?
Because he gets so many things right. So many things right. Did he ever just hold up his glass of sherry and chuckle and go, I got Hitler, but I got Edward VIII wrong? Was he that kind of person who could just admit, because he defended Gallipoli until his dying day?
In terms of his views of Edward VIII, they were coloured in a way by a genuine friendship between the two men, and Winston Churchill was a very loyal friend to those who were loyal to him. But actually, Winston Churchill was able to admit quite quickly that he got it wrong. And interestingly, Clementine had called it absolutely right. There'd been some rather, I think, heated conversations behind closed doors where Clementine had said, surely the gentleman who would become the future George VI should be the one to ascend to the throne and we shouldn't follow this path. And so it was at the coronation of George VI and his wife, who would become Queen Elizabeth, that Winston Churchill turns to Clementine and said, you were right, the other one wouldn't have done. So he very quickly recognises that she got it right.
And Churchill sees the Duke of Windsor multiple times in France before the war, the former Edward VIII. They continued their friendship. It's a little frostier, I think, is your book details, but they have continuing conversations. And then the Windsors just go off the rail. That branch of the Windsor family goes off the rail.
The relationship between Churchill and Edward VIII is certainly tested when Edward VIII is seen on a sort of pseudo-royal tour of Germany with photographs of him smiling, shaking hands with Adolf Hitler. And that's quite late into the 1930s by that point that that meeting happens. I think that would test any friendship, certainly.
Just as disturbing as the pictures of the Kaiser's son, Crown Prince Wilhelm, with the swastika on his arm and smiling. Of all of your visitors to Chartwell, my favorite, Sheila Grant Duff. She just comes out of nowhere. but yet, in many ways, is perhaps the most important visitor of all. Who was she? Why was she important to Churchill? And why was Churchill important to her?
I'm so glad that she's your favourite. Can I just say, first of all, I feel so happy to have been able to shine a spotlight on her.
Oh, it's fabulous. It's fabulous. I don't, some of the names I recognized or students of British or Churchillian history would recognize, but this one was just so different. What was her occupation? What did she bring to Winston Churchill?
Sheila Grant Duff was a journalist. She was a foreign correspondent whose speciality was Czechoslovakia, and that was where she was based most of the time in Prague. She also, very handily, was a distant cousin of Clementine's. So that was in terms of meeting Winston Churchill. Interestingly, she doesn't actually hold similar political beliefs to him generally. She's not a conservative, but she is an extremely charming and very intelligent woman and has this remarkable ability of befriending influential political figures. And she does this to great effect, particularly in Prague. By the time of their first meeting in 1937, you've already got Nazi Germany sort of making moves to expand in terms of their territory. They've already marched into the Rhineland. And then as the following 12 months wears on, you've got the Anschluss with Austria, you've got them wanting the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, and then early in 1939, we have the German troops invading Czechoslovakia itself. So why Sheila Grant Duff is so well placed is because she has the ear of very senior political figures in Czechoslovakia, but she can also relay their opinions and their views in light of the Nazis making it very clear that they've got their eye on Czechoslovakia. And she can relay that to Winston Churchill. So she can give, first-hand accounts of conversations that are happening at the absolute upper levels of politics in Czechoslovakia. Essentially, it's a direct line to Winston Churchill when he is still only a member of parliament. He shouldn't be having this level of insight, but he does, thanks to Sheila.
Winston Churchill loves information like all leaders. To me, the information that she brings is among some of the most unique. Her perspective informs him in ways that are different. How important was it for Churchill to talk to people who are actually, quote unquote, on the ground, not an ambassador in an embassy, but someone who could move freely around and report on things incognito and catch what this is the fever of the people at the moment?
Oh, it's incredibly important. It's a real benefit to Winston Churchill that he is able to have these sources that the British government doesn't have access to. And particularly Czechoslovakia, because the Munich Agreement takes place in September of 1938. So 1 month before the sort of crescendo meeting with Sheila Grant Duff. And at that meeting, various European powers decide the fate of the Sudetenland, which is a region on the west of Czechoslovakia, and it gets decided to give it to Nazi Germany. The Czechoslovakian politicians don't have a seat at the table. They don't actually have a say. So these perspectives of what's going on from the people of Czechoslovakia is making its way to Churchill, but it's not necessarily making its way to the likes of the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who comes back from the Munich Agreement, waving his piece of paper declaring peace in our time. And I think the fact that Churchill has this insight is what leads him to make such prophetic quotes as the one where he says, "You have had the choice between war and dishonour. You have chosen dishonour and you will have war." Because he has this bigger picture informed by this extraordinarily rich intelligence network.
And am I remembering correctly? You mentioned it in your book that Churchill finds out at Chartwell that the Germans have occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia before the British government does?
It's the invasion of Poland.
Is that Poland?
Mhm,
Okay, which
yeah.
happens in September 1st, 1939. So he has sources that are so good and so loyal to him, really, that they go to him first, not Lord Halifax, not Neville Chamberlain, not anyone else.
Yes, and that takes place across the decades. For example, there's a meeting in 1936 where a former French prime minister, a gentleman called Pierre Flandin, comes bringing French estimates of German rearmament. And so Winston Churchill can then go to meetings in Westminster and say, British estimates are this, French estimates are this. And I can see why there's the disparity, but the French are right. And that's because of a conversation he's had behind the doors of his private home. So it really is the case that thanks to these meetings that play out in my book, Churchill's Citadel, that is why Winston Churchill is in the position of knowledge and authority on the subject of the Nazis to be brought back into government in 1939 and in due course be made Prime Minister in 1940, because it's easy to forget. There wasn't an election in 1940. He was just appointed Prime Minister, and there could potentially have been outcry about this at the time. But thanks to him having been right all along in the 30s, thanks to these meetings, that's why that transition was so seamless.
And it comes through in the movie, The Darkest Hour, where I don't know whether it's the actor playing Chamberlain or playing Eden, just flat out says he's been right about Hitler all along. They acknowledge that fact. If I am a student of yours and I write a book, the thesis of which is Chartwell and Churchill's time at Chartwell played basically no role in him becoming prime minister, why would I be wrong? And what grade would you give my thesis?
Why would he be wrong? I would say, in which case, how without Chartwell could he have got this information? It is because he has Chartwell that this gravitational pull of people bringing this information that he then uses across the 30s in speeches, in articles. He blindsides people in Parliament by having more up-to-date statistics than the government has in some instances. And in my opinion, it is without question that those meetings at Chartwell changed the course of history, because without them, it is entirely possible that Churchill might not have been able to have the evidence to back up his position, and his campaign might well have floundered. Some of his speeches in the early 1930s, he admits that he doesn't actually have the statistics to back them up. He's going on what he's heard. And people don't listen to him really at that point. It is because of the role that Chartwell plays as this repository of all the information he needs to make the arguments he does, that history is made, because cometh the hour, cometh the man. And that is because of Chartwell.
And my thesis gets a F.
I'd struggle to agree. I'd be interested to see it, but I would probably strongly disagree with it.
One last question before we get to the 5 questions that we ask all of our guests, including many of your friends. Why didn't, or did they, people like Anthony Eden and Stanley Baldwin, Neville Chamberlain, Lord Halifax, so the people who are running the government and the foreign desk, the foreign policy, did they ever try to stop people from going to Chartwell and say, hey, Winston, work within the government? What's so interesting, in the United States, something like that would be treasonous in a lot of ways, called the Logan Act. But in your book, people come to visit Winston Churchill at Chartwell, and then he writes up a synopsis and sends it to the government. Did anyone ever say, hey, why the hell are they going to you? Send them to us. We're running the country.
I've never come across any reference to objection to Churchill having these meetings at his house, because there is something whereby country houses in Britain have often been the site of political discourse and gatherings of different individuals, exchanging views. So in that sense, it's part of a long-held tradition. And these are people who he's invited to his private home as guests to his home. They're probably going to go for a swim and have some champagne while they're there. It's not solely an exchange of brown envelopes full of statistics, but it's interesting if some information happens to come his way whilst there. What the noise tends to be against Winston Churchill. There was a brilliant quote I found in one set of minutes of a meeting of a government group where they were saying Winston Churchill with his sort of perpetual pin pricking, and he doesn't know the damage he can do with the strength of his pins. So they just think he's like this annoyance. And because so many people write off Winston Churchill at this point of having passed the peak of his political career, he's seen by a lot of people as an irrelevance, as a spent force in British politics. But actually, that kind of serves him well because it means less people are keeping close tabs on what he's up to. So these meetings can happen in the context of his country home without people really batting an eyelid.
It's ironic to think of Churchill as, if not irrelevant, but not necessarily important. Uh, as you mentioned, that people could go there and they'd just be like, fine, go. We don't care. He's not in charge of anything. But yet,
Exactly.
as you just pointed out, it was the dismissing of Churchill, which gave him the freedom to speak the way he did so many times. And your book brings this out marvelously about how people want to hear his views. They go there and they're invited. A lot of people want to be invited, and that's how they get there. But he was as sought after a commentator on world affairs in his time, in this time, as anyone in Britain, if not more. Is that a fair statement?
By the end of the decade, in terms of the sort of general public's perception of Winston Churchill, certainly, because the likes of Stefan Laurent, who was one of the later chapters of my book, the editor of Picture Post, platforms Winston Churchill and gives him a lot of column inches. And he's able to, at that point, reach the masses with what, by that point, seems to be common sense on the subject of Nazi Germany. But he does spend a lot of that decade with people writing him off. So there's a real change curve over the course of that decade from this out of office warmonger who people think keeps making the wrong calls politically. They're questioning his judgment. But by the end of the 1930s, if you look at the summer of 1939, you have newspapers having political cartoons making fun of the government for not bringing back Churchill because it seems so ludicrous that he's been right all along and he's still not in government. There's a definite change over the years, that's fair to say.
If Churchill was very good at, he was obviously excellent at many things, but sometimes I think his greatest talent was having the last word. We've reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests, including Tracy Borman and Susanna Lipscomb and Alexander Larman and Sarah Gristwood and Helen Rappaport. Helen Rappaport has the best answer to one of these questions, so I'll just give you that hint. First question, what was your first job?
My first job was a waitress. As I think a lot of people's was, a bit of extra sort of pocket money sort of job. So not one that led directly to where I am now. I worked very hard in school, but waitress on the side and at that sort of point.
Forgive me for asking, which part of Britain are you from?
I'm from York originally, in Yorkshire, in the north of England. And for anyone who hasn't been, it is one of the most beautiful towns in the country. And not only that, you can't turn a corner without coming across history that is hundreds of years old, if not thousands. So I was very lucky that, despite the waitressing job, even just my everyday life meant that history was positively coming through my pores.
York is a fairy tale. It's a fairy tale city, it's beautiful. Second question, what was your first concert?
Oh, I'm going to have to think about that. I used to be a festival sort of girl back in the day. There's a big festival called Leeds Festival, which
Mhm.
is not too far from York. So a lot of sort of rock acts. You probably wouldn't guess it from speaking to me today, but I was a rock chick back in the day, although that feels like quite a while ago now.
Live at Leeds, the famous Who album.
Exactly. I think Metallica were performing on one of the nights I was there.
I mentioned Helen Rappaport, the famous historian of Russia and the Russian royal family. Her answer was she saw the Beatles in a pub.
Oh, yeah, that I don't think it's possible to top that. I think my Metallica in a Field doesn't compare.
Question number 3. If you could recommend any book for someone to read, which book would you choose?
Do you know what? I'm going to recommend an absolute curveball, which is just the one I'm reading right now because it's one of the most brilliantly written history books. It's called The Complete Victory. It's by a historian called Kevin Weddell. And it's about the Battle of Saratoga. But because he has been a combat veteran in his time, he writes it with these really intuitive observations. Like, of course, this thing doesn't work. But it's the sort of thing that to a civilian reading history might not occur to you, but he just lends his own experience in combat so perfectly, and it makes for an absolute page turner. So, The Complete Victory by Kevin Weddell. Oh my gosh, you have it there! Brilliant.
Mr. Weddle is coming on my podcast.
It,
I'll,
it,
I'll send it to you. Yes. I haven't read it. I've read just like little chunks of it. It's such a brilliant victory. I find that just says so much about your intellectual honesty that you would love a book written about Saratoga, which changed the entire course of the Revolutionary War and world history. Correct. And I've been to the battlefield. It's a beautiful place. I'll let Kevin know that he has a distinguished reader at the moment. Fourth question. If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
oh, do you know what? I've got a real soft spot for the Stuarts. And I think the moment of Charles II returning for the restoration of the crown, the sheer party that broke out, that would have been like the party to end all parties. I think Charles II rocking back into London. That would have been a pretty spectacular moment to bear witness to.
And that party lasted for 25 years, as I recall.
I think it was definitely a fun period in British history.
And our branch of the Vane family is descended from his mistress, Barbara Villiers.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, she's an extraordinary figure in British history. Absolutely. Captivating and charming and lots of other things. But yeah, what a wonderful figure to be descended from. That must be. That's a great
discovered that when I went to Raby Castle last year. Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
My gosh. Who would I choose? Do you know, I'm really struggling with that one because normally the quiz question is alive or dead. Then I just reach back into the greats of history. I pick maybe the King Charles. I think I'd probably be in a very grand setting for the dinner as well, which would be rather nice. But I think that even things like I could ask for his views on Winston Churchill. Since they did meet, there are wonderful photos of Prince Charles as he was then shaking hands with Winston Churchill. So that'd be a fascinating conversation, but also to get his insights into the course of his life, being monarch in the 21st century. Yeah, that would be fascinating. I'm going to go with King Charles III.
Or what his great-grandfather, it's George V, right? Because his grandfather was George VI.
Yes.
What his great-grandfather would have thought about King Charles III giving an address in Germany, in German.
That was very impressive. I think ultimately monarchs have a role to play in terms of Britain's place on the world stage. And I think to be able to go to Germany and deliver a speech in German is positioning Britain very highly.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast sponsored by Veteran Strategies, an Indianapolis-based public relations enterprise. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of Pershing McAllister. Our guest today, Katherine Carter, author of Churchill's Citadel, Chartwell and the Gatherings Before the Storm. Katherine, you have written a marvelous book. It is funny, it is incisive, and as much as any book I've read in the last few years, or since I've started this podcast 5 years ago, you make your point and you prove your point. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.